A man who spends his days prosecuting the worst crimes in the state of Georgia never raised his voice once. Not when his garden was poisoned. Not when his neighbors smiled in his face and lied to his family for 2 years. He didn't have to. Because the day the truth came out, it didn't come from his mouth. It came crackling through a police radio, in front of God and the whole cul-de-sac, and the man who thought he was untouchable finally understood exactly who he'd been spitting on. Before we get into this one, drop a comment and let me know what city you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this hit something in you, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got 2 more lined up after this one that I think you're going to need to see. Now let's go to Sycamore Ridge. Sycamore Ridge sat 20 minutes outside downtown Atlanta, the kind of subdivision built in the early 2000s with brick-front colonials, cul-de-sacs named after trees that had never grown there, and a homeowners association that took its landscaping bylaws more seriously than most cities took their actual laws. In spring, the whole neighborhood turned green and gold, dogwoods blooming along Persimmon Court, sprinklers ticking awake at 6 a.m., the smell of cut grass drifting over low picket fences. At 214 Persimmon Court, the Whitfield family had the best garden on the block, and everybody knew it. It sat along the back property line, for raised beds built from cedar planks that had silvered with age, packed tight with tomato vines climbing wire cages, deep green collared leaves the size of dinner plates, okra stalks taller than a grown man, and a wall of sunflowers that turned their faces east every morning like they were waiting for something. It wasn't just a garden. It was the last thing Renata Whitfield had built with her hands before the cancer took her 3 years ago. And it was the only place in the world where her daughter Jada still felt like her mother hadn't really left. Marcus Whitfield knelt in the dirt most mornings before sunrise, still in his undershirt, working a hand trowel around the base of a tomato plant while the sky went from navy to gray to gold. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered but soft-spoken, the kind of man who took his time answering a question because he'd learned a long time ago that most people talk too fast and regret it. By 8 a.m. he'd be in a courtroom in downtown Atlanta, wearing a $3,000 suit, cross-examining defense witnesses with the calm precision of a surgeon. But out here, in the dirt, he was just Jada's dad, keeping a promise to a woman who wasn't there to keep it herself. "You gonna water the collards, or just stare at them?" Jada asked, coming out the back door in pajama pants and one of her mother's old cardigans, 2 mugs of coffee in her hands. 15 years old, sharp-tongued, sharper-eyed, she noticed things. She always had. "Was thinking about it," Marcus said, taking the mug. "You get your chem homework done?" "Last night. You know, if you actually check my backpack instead of just asking." He almost smiled. "I trust you. That's a nice way of saying you forgot." From the other side of the fence, a voice cut through the morning quiet, thick with a kind of forced cheerfulness that never quite reached the eyes. "Morning, folks." Gary Pruitt stood at his own back fence in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, watching them the way a man watches something he's decided he doesn't like but hasn't figured out how to say so directly. 58, thick around the middle, silver hair combed back, a face that had spent decades being the loudest man in every room he walked into. He'd lived on Persimmon Court for 26 years. He'd sat on the HOA board for 20 of them, right up until 2 years ago, when a vote he didn't see coming replaced him with someone younger, someone the board apparently liked better. He hadn't gotten over it. He talked about it the way some men talk about wars they'd fought in. "Morning, Gary," Marcus said, even unbothered, the same tone he used with hostile witnesses. "That garden of yours is really something," Gary said, and something in the way he said something made it clear he didn't mean it as a compliment. "Getting bigger every year, seems like. Spreading right up along my side of the fence." "It's on our property line, Gary. Same as it's been." "Just an observation." Gary took a sip of his coffee, eyes flicking to Jada, then back to the garden, then back to Marcus. "Some of the other folks on the block have mentioned it too. Said it's starting to look a little, I don't know, unruly. This isn't that kind of neighborhood, if you know what I mean." Jada's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. She'd known since she was 13, and Gary Pruitt had asked her, in front of 3 other kids at the mailbox, whether her family rented or owned, like the answer would explain something about the sunflowers. Marcus set his coffee mug down on the fence post, slow and deliberate. It's a vegetable garden, Gary. It's not going anywhere. Didn't say it should. Gary smiled, the kind of smile that had learned exactly how far it could go without ever technically crossing a line. Just making an observation. HOA's got standards for a reason. Wouldn't want anybody getting a letter. We've read the bylaws, Marcus said. We're in compliance. For now, Gary said, and turned back toward his house, whistling something tuneless, leaving the words hanging in the morning air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Jada watched him go, arms crossed. He does this like every week now. I know. Aren't you going to say something? Like actually say something. Marcus picked his coffee back up, looked out at the sunflowers, at the collards his wife had planted with her own 2 hands a spring before she got sick. Saying something to a man like that in his own driveway doesn't change anything, baby. It just gives him a story to tell about how aggressive we were. He said the word with the exact flat weight it deserved. There's a difference between not saying anything and not giving him what he wants. So what, we just take it? Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment. The same stubborn set inner jaw that her mother used to get. The same refusal to let an injustice sit quiet just because it was inconvenient to name it. No, he said quietly. We don't take it. We just don't hand him the reaction he's fishing for. There's a difference, Jada. I promise you, there's a difference. She didn't look convinced. She picked up the garden hose and started watering the collards without another word, and Marcus let her be, because some lessons a 15-year-old has to arrive at on her own timeline, not her father's. Neither of them noticed Gary Pruitt pause at his own back door, glancing once more over his shoulder at the garden, at the tomatoes, the sunflowers, the collards, with an expression that had stopped being about property values a long time ago, if it had ever really been about that at all. By the time the sun was fully up over Persimmon Court, Marcus was already gone, off to a courthouse 40 minutes away, where he'd spend the day building a case against men far more dangerous than his neighbor. He had no idea that the real fight of the season was about to start in his own backyard, and that Gary Pruitt was about to make a decision that would end, in a way nobody on that street could have predicted, with the sheriff's radio saying 4 words that would change everything. The first letter came on a Tuesday. Marcus found it in the mailbox between a water bill and a grocery flyer, HOA letterhead, official seal in the corner, the kind of formatting designed to make a homeowner's stomach drop before they even read the words. He stood at the end of the driveway and read it twice. Dear homeowner, *, it has come to the association's attention that landscaping at 214 Persimmon Court may be in violation of Section 4.2 of the Community Bylaws regarding vegetation height, spread, and visual uniformity. Please schedule a compliance inspection within 14 days, *. He knew the bylaws. He'd read every page of the HOA handbook the week they moved in. The way he read everything, carefully, twice, looking for the parts other people skimmed past. Section 4.2 governed hedges and ornamental shrubs along front-facing property lines. It said nothing about vegetable gardens in a backyard. It said nothing, in fact, that could plausibly apply to 4 raised beds set well within their own property line. He called the HOA office that afternoon. The woman who answered, apologetic and clearly overworked, pulled up the complaint log. It says here the complaint was filed by a resident, she said. I can't disclose who, that's confidential, but... You don't need to disclose it, Marcus said evenly. I already know. He didn't file a rebuttal right away. He photographed the garden from every angle, printed the actual bylaw text with Section 4.2 highlighted, and mailed it back with a 2-paragraph letter, polite and airtight. The same tone he used when a defense attorney tried a procedural stunt in front of a judge who wasn't in the mood for games. The complaint was dismissed within a week. Gary didn't stop. He escalated. The second complaint alleged excessive noise from the Whitfield's backyard, a claim built entirely around the one Saturday afternoon in April when Denise Coleman from next door had come over with her Bluetooth speaker for Jada's birthday, for girls laughing in the yard until 9 p.m., well within the HOA's quiet hours cutoff. Denise, a nurse who worked 12-hour shifts and had lived beside the Whitfields for 6 years, was furious when she heard about it. He complained about a birthday party, she said, standing in Marcus's kitchen with her arms crossed, still in scrubs from her shift. Marcus, I was standing right there. It wasn't even loud. My own kids were louder at their sleepover last month, and nobody said a word. I know, Marcus said. You know? That's it? You know, I filed the response already. It'll get dismissed same as the last one. Denise shook her head, exasperated in the specific way of someone who loved a friend enough to be angrier on his behalf than he seemed willing to be for himself. That man has lived here 26 years and been miserable about something new every single one of them. You know what changed 2 years ago, right? When the board voted him off. I know what changed, Marcus said quietly. He's not mad about a garden, Marcus. He's mad you two moved in and didn't ask his permission to exist here. Marcus didn't answer that directly. He rarely did, when the truth was too plainly ugly to argue with. Instead, he said, the system's built to handle this, Denise. Every complaint he files that gets dismissed weakens whatever he's building toward. I've watched people talk themselves into a hole for a living. He's digging his. And what's he building toward? Marcus looked out the kitchen window, past the sink, to where the garden sat glowing gold in the late afternoon light. Jada's silhouette moving between the tomato cages, checking for hornworms the way her mother taught her. I don't know yet, he admitted, but I don't think he's finished. He was right. Over the following weeks, Gary Pruitt's campaign took on a rhythm. A complaint about an unregistered storage shed that turned out to be a compost bin. A complaint about improper drainage that an HOA inspector dismissed after a 15-minute site visit. A complaint filed anonymously but unmistakably his, alleging that the Whitfield's garden was attracting rodents, an accusation so baseless the HOA didn't even bother sending an inspector. Each dismissal seemed to feed something in him rather than discourage it. Neighbors started noticing. Tom Alvarez from 3 doors down mentioned to Denise that Gary had cornered him at the mailbox to complain, unprompted, about certain people bringing down the whole street. Gary never said Marcus's name. He never had to. Everyone on Persimmon Court understood exactly who he meant, and most of them found reasons not to say anything about it, the way people in comfortable places often do when the ugliness isn't pointed at them. Marcus kept a folder, not out of paranoia, out of habit. 20 years of prosecuting cases had taught him one immovable truth. Patterns matter more than incidents. A single complaint was noise. 5 complaints, all baseless, all originating from the same direction, all escalating in both frequency and specificity. That was a pattern, and patterns were the thing juries actually convicted on. He didn't tell Jada about the folder. He didn't want her carrying the weight of what he suspected was coming. But some nights, after she'd gone to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the porch light off, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight, and felt something he rarely let himself feel on the job. A low, cold unease that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the particular flavor of a man's resentment when it stops being about complaints and starts looking for something it can actually destroy. The 5th complaint came at the end of the month, denied by the HOA in 11 minutes flat, a new record. Marcus read the dismissal letter standing at his own back fence, close enough to see Gary Pruitt's kitchen light on, a shadow moving behind the curtain. He didn't say anything. He folded the letter, put it in his jacket pocket, and went inside to help Jada with her homework, the way he did every night. Try not to think about what a man does when he runs out of official channels and still isn't done. He wouldn't have to wonder for long. Jada found it first. She came out the back door Saturday morning in her mother's old cardigan, coffee mugs in hand the way she did every weekend, already talking before she even reached the porch steps. Something about a chemistry quiz, something about a boy in her class who'd gotten the wrong answer on purpose to make her laugh. She stopped mid-sentence. The garden was dying, not wilting from heat, not drooping the way tomato vines sometimes do in the thick of an Atlanta afternoon. This was different, and even a 15-year-old who'd spent 3 summers in that dirt could tell the difference in an instant. The collared leaves had curled inward and yellowed at the edges overnight, gone the color of old newspaper. The tomato vines hung slack on their cages, leaves blackened at the veins like they'd been scorched from the inside. The sunflowers, her mother's sunflowers, the ones that turned east every morning like they were waiting for something, had folded over at the stalk, heads bowed to the dirt. The mugs slipped out of her hands. One shattered on the patio stone. "Dad," Marcus came out in sweatpants and bare feet, and for a moment he just stood there, the same stillness that had carried him through 20 years of courtrooms, failing him completely for the first time in longer than he could remember. He walked to the edge of the beds and crouched down, running a thumb along a collared leaf that came apart in his hand like wet paper. "This isn't heat," he said quietly. "This isn't drought stress." He'd grown up around gardens, around his grandmother's tomatoes in South Georgia, and he knew what natural die-off looked like. This wasn't natural. This was fast, and it was uniform, and it followed a line that ran straight along the fence separating their yard from Gary Pruitt's. Jada was crying now, quiet, angry tears, kneeling beside a sunflower that had been over 6 feet tall a week ago, and now lay collapsed against the raised bed frame. "Dad, this is Mom's. This is Mom's." "I know, baby." His voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "I know." Denise came over within the hour, still in the t-shirt she slept in, and it took her exactly one look at the die-off pattern, and one long sniff near the base of the fence line, before her expression changed. "You smell that?" she asked, crouching low near the fence post. Marcus knelt beside her. Underneath the wet earth smell of the garden, there was something else, chemical, sharp, faintly sweet in the way that certain herbicides are, a smell he vaguely recognized from lawn treatment trucks that used to roll through his grandmother's neighborhood. "Yeah," he said. "I smell it." "That's not fertilizer runoff," Denise said. "I don't know exactly what it is, but I know what it isn't. This isn't something that happens from bad luck, Marcus." Along the base of the fence, pressed into the soft dirt of the flower bed, there were footprints, boot prints, the tread partially filled in by an early morning sprinkler cycle, but still visible enough to make out size and shape. They led from a gap under the fence's bottom rail, tracked in a straight line along the property boundary, and back out again. Jada had gone quiet, staring at the footprints, then at the fence, then at the dark kitchen window of the house next door where a shadow had briefly moved and then vanished. "He wouldn't," she said, though her voice made clear she didn't believe her own sentence. "Would he?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He photographed the footprints from 3 angles, photographed the die-off pattern along the fence line, photographed the sunflowers collapsed in the dirt, working with the same methodical calm he brought to a crime scene walkthrough, because some part of him, the part that had spent 2 decades building cases out of the wreckage other people left behind, had already started building this one. "I don't know what he would or wouldn't do anymore," he finally said. "But I know what I'm looking at, and I know what we do next." "Which is what?" "We don't confront him," Marcus said, standing, brushing the dirt from his knees. "We document. We report it exactly like we'd want anyone else to report it, and we let it go through the process the right way." "The process didn't stop him from doing this," Jada said, gesturing at the ruined beds, her voice cracking. "5 complaints, Dad. 5, and they all got thrown out, and none of it stopped him. Why does the process matter now?" Marcus looked at his daughter, at the tears on her face, at the garden her mother had built with her own hands now lying dead in the dirt, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let her see something other than composure. "Because this time," he said quietly, "there's evidence. And evidence is the only thing that's ever mattered in any case I've won." He called the sheriff's non-emergency line himself, gave his address, and requested an officer come document damage to residential property. He didn't mention his job. He didn't mention anything beyond what the dispatcher needed to know. 20 minutes later, a patrol car turned onto Persimmon Court, and across the fence, a curtain in Gary Pruitt's kitchen window shifted, just slightly, before falling still again. Marcus watched it settle, and something in his chest, quiet, controlled. The same stillness he brought to a closing argument, hardened into resolve. Let him watch, he thought. Let him wonder. He had no idea yet how quickly and how completely Gary Pruitt was about to find out exactly who he'd been watching. Deputy Renee Castillo arrived at 2:14, Persimmon Court a little before 11, parked her cruiser along the curb, and spent the first 20 minutes doing exactly what a good officer does. Nothing dramatic. She walked the fence line with a notepad, crouched by the footprints Marcus had photographed and roped off with garden stakes, and strings so nothing would disturb them further, and asked careful, specific questions. "Anybody touched these since you found them?" "No, ma'am," Marcus said. "I photographed them first thing, then left them as is." Good. She was 33, sharp-eyed, with a kind of unhurried professionalism that came from having sat through enough neighbor disputes to know most of them were nothing, and enough of them were something, that she'd learned not to assume either way until the evidence told her. She snapped her own photos, measured the boot print with a small ruler she pulled from her belt, and made a note of the chemical smell along the fence base. "I'm going to want soil samples sent for testing," she said. "That's not something I can eyeball and confirm, but I've smelled enough lawn treatment chemicals in my life to tell you this isn't nothing. You said the die-off happened overnight. Between yesterday evening and this morning," Marcus confirmed. "Garden was fine when my daughter watered it last night around 7. Castillo wrote that down too. "And you have reason to believe it's connected to your neighbor?" Marcus hesitated, not because he doubted it, but because 2 decades of prosecuting cases had taught him the exact difference between what he believed and what he could prove, and he was careful never to let the first one get ahead of the second in front of an officer taking notes. "I have a documented pattern of escalating complaints from that direction over the past several weeks," he said, "all dismissed by the HOA as baseless. I'm not going to tell you who did this. I'm going to tell you what I can show you, and let the evidence speak." Castillo looked at him for a moment, something flickering behind her eyes, the recognition of a man who talked like someone who'd spent a lot of time in rooms where words got weighed and measured before they left your mouth. "That's a pretty careful way to answer that question." "Habit," Marcus said simply. She was midway through writing up the initial incident report, balancing her notepad against the hood of her cruiser, when the back door of the neighboring house opened and Gary Pruitt came out onto his own back porch in a golf shirt and khakis, coffee mug in hand, wearing an expression of theatrical concern that fooled exactly no one standing in that yard. "Everything all right over there, officer?" he called out, ambling toward the fence like a man who had all the time in the world. "Saw the cruiser. Hope nothing serious." "Just documenting a property damage report, sir," Castillo said evenly, not looking up from her notepad. "Property damage, my goodness." Gary set his coffee mug on the fence post, the exact same spot Marcus had set his own 2 weeks before, and peered over into the Whitfields' yard with an expression that tried hard for surprise and landed somewhere closer to a man checking his own homework. "Garden looks rough. Shame. Course, these things happen sometimes. Soil gets tired. You plant the same beds year after year. Without rotating, nutrients get depleted. Happens to the best of us." "We rotate every season," Jada said flatly, arms crossed, standing a few feet behind her father. "This isn't soil depletion." "Well, I'm no expert," Gary said, holding up both hands in mock surrender, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth that he didn't quite manage to suppress. "Just offering some neighborly perspective. Hate to see all that hard work go to waste over, whatever this turns out to be." Marcus said nothing. He'd cross-examined enough witnesses to recognize the particular rhythm of a man who was talking too much. Filling silence, he found uncomfortable with words that weren't doing him any favors. He let it stretch. Gary, uncomfortable with the quiet, kept filling it. "You folks putting in a report for this?" Gary asked, glancing at Castillo's notepad. "Seems like a lot of fuss over some dead vegetables. I mean, no offense, but the sheriff's department's got real crime to worry about. Wouldn't want to waste anybody's time." "It's not a waste of my time, sir," Castillo said, still writing, voice pleasant and entirely unbothered. "Property damage is property damage." Sure. Gary picked his coffee back up, took a slow sip, and something in his posture settled into the particular ease of a man who genuinely believed this was going nowhere. The same ease he'd carried through 5 dismissed complaints, through 2 years of needling comments over a fence, through a lifetime, perhaps, of watching consequences land on other people and never quite reach 'em. "You folks let me know if you need anything. Happy to cooperate, of course. Got nothing to hide." It was right about then, as Gary stood at the fence with that small satisfied smile still tugging at his mouth, that the radio clipped to Castillo's shoulder crackled to life. Unit 14, be advised District Attorney's Office is requesting a callback regarding the Halloran filing. They're asking if you can confirm Deputy Prosecutor Whitfield's availability for a pre-trial conference Monday morning. The yard went very still. Castillo glanced up unbothered, already reaching for the radio to key back a routine response. Copy that, I'll relay the message. She looked at Marcus, professional, unhurried. Sir, they're asking about a pre-trial conference Monday. Is that something you're expecting? Yes, Marcus said, voice even. The same measured calm he'd carried through every complaint, every accusation, every small cruelty absorbed at that fence over 2 years. Halloran trial starts in 3 weeks. I'll call the office back this afternoon. Gary Pruitt had gone very quiet. The coffee mug stayed frozen halfway to his mouth. His eyes moved from a radio on Castillo's shoulder, to Marcus standing calm and unreadable in his own backyard, to the dead garden between them, and something behind his face was visibly recalculating. Fast and too late, the way a man's expression shifts when he realizes he's been standing in a room the whole time, without knowing what kind of room it was. Deputy, prosecutor, Gary repeated slowly, like the words didn't fit together right in his mouth. You're a senior deputy state prosecutor, Castillo said helpfully, not looking up from her notepad, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the weight the words carried as they landed. Fulton County DA's office. Small world. Nobody in that yard said anything for a long moment. Jada looked at her father, then at Gary, then back at her father. Something shifting in her own face too, not surprise, because she'd always known what her father did for a living, but something closer to satisfaction, watching the information land on the one man who'd spent 2 years assuming he already knew everything worth knowing about the family next door. Gary set his coffee mug down on the fence post with a hand that wasn't quite steady. I didn't realize, he said, and for the first time since Marcus had known him, Gary Pruitt seemed to be searching for words instead of supplying them freely. No reason you would have, Marcus said quietly. I don't lead with it. Right, of course. Gary attempted a smile that didn't come close to landing. Well, I'm sure this'll all get sorted out. Neighborly misunderstanding, probably. These things usually are. We'll see what the soil testing shows, Castillo said, closing her notepad with a small, final snap. I'll have results back within the week. In the meantime, sir, she glanced at Gary with polite, professional neutrality. I'd appreciate it if you didn't leave the state or make any changes to your property near that fence line. Standard practice while an investigation's open. Gary opened his mouth, closed it, and for once in 2 years, didn't have a single word to offer. He turned and walked back toward his house without another glance at the garden. His easy stride from 20 minutes earlier replaced by something stiffer, smaller, a man suddenly aware of how much ground he'd need to make up and how little he actually had to stand on. Marcus watched him go, expression unchanged, betraying nothing. But Denise, who'd come out onto her own porch halfway through the exchange and witnessed the whole thing, caught his eye across the yard and gave the smallest nod, the kind two people share when they both know something has just shifted permanently, in a way that couldn't be talked back. Dad, Jada said quietly, once Gary's door had shut behind him. He had no idea. No, Marcus agreed, looking down at the ruined garden, at the collapsed sunflowers that had once turned east every morning like they were waiting for something. He didn't. But he's about to. The soil test results came back 9 days later, and they didn't leave much room for interpretation. Marcus received the call from the sheriff's forensic liaison on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in the hallway outside a courtroom during a 15-minute recess, still in his suit, a folder of unrelated case notes tucked under one arm. He listened without saying much, the way he always did when someone was giving him information that mattered, letting silence do the work of encouraging the other person to keep talking. Lab confirmed elevated concentrations of tricloper and 2 for D along the fence line samples, the liaison said. That's a broadleaf herbicide combination, commercial grade, well above anything you'd get from consumer lawn care products. It's the kind of stuff licensed applicators use or contractors who've got access to it through commercial supply. Concentration was heaviest right at the boundary and tapered out as it moved into your beds, consistent with a direct application along the property line rather than drift from a legal treatment somewhere else. Consistent with someone standing at the fence and applying it directly, Marcus said. That'd be my read, yeah. Marcus thanked him, hung up, and stood in the hallway a moment longer than he needed to, turning the information over with the same careful patience he brought to any piece of new evidence, not rushing to conclusions, but letting the shape of the thing settle into focus. Deputy Castillo followed up two things simultaneously. The first was a canvass of licensed pesticide applicators and commercial suppliers in a 15-mile radius, cross-referenced against purchase records for that specific herbicide combination. It didn't take long. Gary Pruitt had spent 31 years running an HVAC contracting business before retiring, and licensed contractors in Georgia often carried adjacent certifications, including, in his case, a lapsed but still searchable commercial pesticide applicator's license from a decade back, and a garage full of leftover supply from a landscaping side venture he'd run in his 50s. The second thing was a warrant. It wasn't dramatic. There was no dawn raid, no flashing lights outside Gary's Colonial at 216 Persimmon Court. Castillo and a second deputy arrived on a quiet Thursday morning with paperwork signed by a magistrate judge, searched the garage with Gary standing in the driveway in his bathrobe, arms crossed, jaw tight, saying nothing beyond the bare minimum his attorney, hastily, retained the day after the fence line conversation, had instructed him to say. They found a half-empty jug of the exact herbicide blend matching the soil samples, tucked behind a shelf of old paint cans, along with a spray applicator still faintly smelling of the same chemical. Gary was arrested that afternoon and charged with criminal damage to property in the second degree and a violation of Georgia's agricultural chemical application statute, a charge normally reserved for licensed applicators who misuse commercial-grade product outside the bounds of their certification, which, given his lapsed license, applied here with unusual precision. The story moved through Sycamore Ridge the way stories like that always do, not through any official announcement, but through the particular alchemy of one neighbor mentioning it to another over a mailbox, a driveway, a fence. By Friday evening, most of Persimmon Court knew. Tom Alvarez, who'd once told Denise about Gary cornering him with complaints about certain people, came by the Whitfield's house that weekend with a six-pack of sparkling water and an apology he hadn't been asked for. I should have said something sooner, he admitted, standing awkward on the porch, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. He talked to me about you too sometimes, nothing I'd ever repeat, nothing I agreed with, and I just kind of gnawed along and changed the subject because I didn't want the confrontation. I regret that now. Genuinely. I appreciate you saying so, Marcus said, and meant it, though he'd learned a long time ago that regret offered after the fact carried a different weight than intervention offered before it. Useful, but not the same thing. Marcus's own office handled the matter carefully. Given his position within the Fulton County DA's office, his direct supervisor formally recused Marcus from any prosecutorial role in the case, a conflict of interest too obvious to ignore, and the file was referred to a neighboring county's prosecutor's office to avoid even the appearance of undue influence. Marcus agreed with the decision immediately, before anyone had to ask him to. I don't want a conviction that anybody can point to later and say it only happened because of who I am, he told the supervisor. I want it to happen because of what he did. Those need to stay separate. His supervisor, a woman who'd worked alongside Marcus for 11 years, studied him for a moment. That's a more generous instinct than most people would have in your position. It's not generosity, Marcus said. It's just how the system's supposed to work. I've spent my whole career telling other people that. I'm not going to make an exception for myself. The civil side moved faster than the criminal side, as it often does. Marcus, on the advice of a colleague who specialized in property law, filed suit against Gary Pruitt for damages, not out of vindictiveness, but because the garden's replacement, the soil remediation, the professional testing required to confirm the yard was safe to replant, all carried real costs that shouldn't fall on his family for a crime he hadn't committed. Jada asked him about it one evening, sitting at the kitchen table over homework she wasn't really doing. Does it feel weird? Suing your actual neighbor? Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things she asked him lately. A little, he admitted. But he made a choice that cost us something real, and pretending that cost doesn't exist doesn't help either of us heal from it. This isn't about revenge, Jada. It's about making sure the account gets settled honestly. There's a difference. You keep saying that there's a difference. Because there always is, Marcus said. Even when it's hard to see in the moment. Outside the kitchen window, the raised bed sat empty and bare, waiting, the soil turned but not yet replanted. the fence line quiet in a way it hadn't been in over 2 years. Marcus looked out at it sometimes in the evenings, not with anger, but with something closer to resolve. The particular patience of a man who'd built his entire career on the belief that the truth, given enough time and the right process, tended to find its way to daylight. It had. And Gary Pruitt was about to discover just how much daylight was coming. The HOA meeting where Gary Pruitt's name came up officially was, by all accounts, one of the most attended in Sycamore Ridge's history. It wasn't scheduled as anything special, just the regular third Thursday of the month gathering in the clubhouse community room. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A pitcher of lukewarm lemonade on the back table that nobody touched. But word had spread through the neighborhood group chat that the board intended to address recent developments involving a resident. And by 7 p.m., nearly every chair was filled, including several neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years. Marcus didn't go. He'd been asked by the board president, gently, whether he'd want to speak, and he'd declined just as gently in return. "This isn't my fight to make a spectacle of," he told her over the phone. "You have the facts. The charges are public record. Let the board handle its own governance the way it's supposed to." So it was Denise who went, sitting near the back, texting him updates in real time that he read later that night, after Jada had gone to bed. The board's decision was procedural but unambiguous. Gary Pruitt was formally removed from all remaining committee involvement. He'd stayed on the landscaping subcommittee even after losing his board seat 2 years earlier, and a permanent violation notice was entered into the property record at 216 Persimmon Court, citing the pending criminal case and the documented pattern of harassment complaints against the Whitfield family, several of which the board now acknowledged, on the record, had been retaliatory in nature and lacking factual basis. It wasn't a criminal penalty. It didn't need to be. In a neighborhood where reputation moved currency the way money did in other places, it was its own kind of sentence. The civil suit settled faster than Marcus's attorney had expected. Gary's lawyer, reviewing the soil test results, the seized herbicide, and the security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera that had captured a shadowy figure at the fence line at 5:40 that morning, advised his client that a trial would only compound the damage. Gary agreed to a settlement, $9,400 for garden replacement, professional soil remediation and testing costs, plus an additional $4,600 covering emotional distress and legal fees, combined with the fine attached to his eventual guilty plea on the reduced criminal charge. He avoided a full trial by accepting a plea deal that included a fine, 18 months of probation and mandatory community service, but no jail time. His total financial exposure crossed $14,000. It wasn't the number that seemed to land hardest on him, according to what filtered back through the neighborhood. It was smaller things. His son, Kevin, who'd driven up from Chattanooga every couple of months for as long as anyone on Persimmon Court could remember, stopped visiting as often. Denise heard it secondhand from Tom Alvarez, who'd heard it from Kevin himself at a gas station one weekend. A brief, uncomfortable conversation where Kevin had admitted, unprompted, that he was embarrassed as hell and needed some space from his father to process it. The neighbors who'd once laughed along with Gary's comments at the mailbox, who'd nodded and changed the subject the way Tom Alvarez had, started doing something they hadn't done in years. They stopped laughing. Nobody organized it. Nobody sent a memo. It simply happened. The quiet way social consequence tend to happen in places like Sycamore Ridge. Invitations that used to include him no longer did. Conversations that used to linger at his end of the street grew shorter. A kind of collective recalibration that Gary felt every single day, without anyone ever having to say a word about it directly. He kept mowing his lawn on Saturday mornings. He kept his flag out front, his mailbox freshly painted. His HOA dues paid on time, same as always. But something had shifted in how the street moved around him, a wide, unspoken berth that hadn't existed 2 months earlier, and that no amount of dues or lawn care could undo. Marcus, for his part, didn't take satisfaction in any of it. He noted it, the way he noted most developments in a case even after it had left his hands, but he didn't seek it out or dwell on it. Jada asked him about it once, watching from the window, as Gary loaded grocery bags into his car alone. No wave from the Alvarez house across the street, where a wave used to be automatic. "Doesn't it feel good?" she asked, watching people finally see him. Marcus considered the question with the same care he gave most things she asked him. "It feels like something's settling into place that should have settled a long time ago," he said. "But I try not to let myself enjoy watching a man's life come apart, even when he built the wreckage himself. That's not the kind of person I want to be, or the kind I want you to become. Even after everything he did to Mom's garden." "Especially after that," Marcus said. "Because if I let this turn into something I take pleasure in, I've let him change who I am. And I'm not willing to hand him that." Jada didn't fully understand it yet. He could see that in her face, the particular restlessness of a 15-year-old who wanted the story to end with something closer to triumph than restraint. But she filed it away the way she filed most things her father said, the way she'd come to understand, slowly, over years, that his calm wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the discipline of choosing which feelings got to drive. 3 weeks later, a small padded envelope arrived at 214 Persimmon Court, no return address, no note inside, just a folded printout of an apology, unsigned, that Marcus recognized immediately as a first draft of something Gary hadn't yet worked up the nerve to say out loud. He wouldn't have to wait long before Gary tried again, in person this time. "You keep saying that there's a difference." "Because there always is," Marcus said, "even when it's hard to see in the moment." Outside the kitchen window, the raised bed sat empty and bare, waiting, the soil turned but not yet replanted, the fence line quiet in a way it hadn't been in over 2 years. Marcus looked out at it sometimes in the evenings, not with anger, but with something closer to resolve, the particular patience of a man who'd built his entire career on the belief that the truth, given enough time and the right process, tended to find its way to daylight. It had. And Gary Pruitt was about to discover just how much daylight was coming. Gary Pruitt showed up at the Whitfields' front door on a Sunday afternoon in October, 3 months after the arrest, wearing a collared shirt instead of his usual golf polo, the kind of small wardrobe choice that read unmistakably, as an attempt to look like a man who took the moment seriously. Marcus saw him through the front window before the doorbell rang, and had a full 3 seconds to decide how he wanted to handle it. He opened the door before Gary could knock a second time. "Marcus," Gary said, and his voice had none of its old easy confidence in it. It came out smaller, more careful, a man picking his way across ground he no longer trusted. "I know I've got no right showing up here. I understand if you want to shut the door. I needed to say some things, and I needed to say them to your face instead of hiding behind an envelope." Marcus glanced back into the house. Jada stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching from a distance that made clear she wasn't going anywhere. He looked back at Gary and stepped out onto the porch instead, pulling the door mostly closed behind him, not shutting Jada out, but not inviting this conversation into the house either. "I'm listening," Marcus said. Gary shifted his weight, hands jammed into his pockets, eyes not quite meeting Marcus's. "I've had a lot of time to sit with what I did. The probation, the community service. I've been doing roadside cleanup on 285 twice a week since September. And let me tell you, there's nothing like 6 hours picking up other people's trash off a highway shoulder to make a man think hard about how he ended up there." He attempted something like a self-deprecating laugh. It didn't land. "I poisoned your garden because I was angry about losing my board seat, and somewhere along the way I decided you were an easier thing to be angry at than the actual people who voted me off. That's not an excuse. I know that's not an excuse. I wanted you to hear me say it plainly, man to man." "I appreciate you saying it plainly," Marcus said, voice even. "That matters more than you might think." Gary looked up, something like hope flickering across his face. "Does that mean?" "It means I heard you," Marcus said, cutting gently ahead of whatever Gary was about to ask for. "It doesn't mean everything's settled between us. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now." Gary's shoulders dropped slightly, but he nodded, like a man bracing for something he'd expected. "Okay, you didn't do this once," Marcus continued. "You spent 2 years building toward it. 5 complaints, all of them baseless. All of them aimed at making my family feel unwelcome in a place we have every right to be. The garden wasn't the first thing you tried to take from us. It was just the first thing you actually managed to destroy. I think it's important you hear that distinction, because an apology for one bad morning is a different thing than an apology for a pattern. And I don't think you've fully reckoned with which one this actually is. Gary was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, the kind of silence that comes when a man is being asked to sit with something uncomfortable instead of talking his way past it. "You're right," he finally said, and it seemed to cost him something to say it. "I told myself for a long time that it was about property values, about the neighborhood, about, principles I made up to feel better about myself. But if I'm being honest with you right now, standing on this porch, some of it was just about not liking that you two were here. And I let that ugliness sit in me for 2 years without ever really looking at it straight on. I'm ashamed of that. Genuinely." "I believe you're ashamed," Marcus said. "I don't doubt that's real. But shame and change aren't the same thing, Gary. One of them is a feeling. The other one is a choice you make every day for a long time, whether anybody's watching or not. What would that look like? Me making that choice?" Marcus considered the question honestly, the same way he considered most things, unhurried, precise, unwilling to hand out an answer that sounded good but meant nothing. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "That's not something I can hand you a checklist for. But I'd start by paying attention to how you talk about people, even when you think nobody who matters is listening. The mailbox conversations, the comments at the fence. That's where this started, long before it ever got to a herbicide jug in your garage." Gary flinched slightly at that, but didn't argue. "I'm not going to tell you I forgive you," Marcus said. "Not today. Forgiveness isn't something I can hand over just because you asked for it in the right tone of voice, standing on the right porch. That's not how it works, and I think you'd respect me less if I pretended otherwise. What I can tell you is that I'm not interested in carrying hatred for you for the next 20 years we're going to be living 12 feet apart. That's too heavy a thing to drag around, and it's not a weight I'm willing to hand my daughter either." "So where does that leave us?" "Somewhere in between," Marcus said. "I understand what you're telling me. I believe some part of it is genuine. But this isn't about one moment on a porch. It's about a pattern that took 2 years to build and one morning to reveal how deep it went. That kind of thing doesn't get resolved with an apology. It gets resolved, if it ever does, through a long stretch of you actually being different, and me actually watching you be different for longer than either of us is going to feel comfortable with." Gary nodded slowly, something in his posture settling into an acceptance that looked, for the first time since Marcus had known him, less performed than the rest of the conversation had been. "That's fair," he said quietly. "More fair than I probably deserve, honestly." "Probably," Marcus agreed, without cruelty, just plain fact. "But I'd rather be fair than be right about how unfair I could be. That's a distinction I built a whole career on, Gary. I'm not going to abandon it in my own front yard." Gary managed something close to a real smile, small and rueful. "Your daughters still hate my guts." "That's between you and her," Marcus said. "I'm not going to speak for how she feels. But I guess showing her over time that you meant what you said today would go further than anything you say to me on this porch." Gary nodded, seeming to understand that the conversation had reached its natural end. "Thank you for hearing me out. I know you didn't owe me that." "I didn't," Marcus agreed. "But I try to give people the same fairness I'd want given to somebody I was prosecuting. Everybody deserves to be heard honestly, even when what they did was wrong. That's not weakness. That's just what the job's taught me matters." Gary turned to leave, then paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking back once. "For what it's worth, that garden. I heard you're replanting it." "We are," Marcus said. "Come spring." "I hope it comes in even better than before," Gary said, and for once, it didn't sound like a performance. It sounded like a man who meant it, even if he hadn't yet earned the right to say it without complication. Marcus watched him walk back across the yard toward his own house, then went back inside, where Jada was waiting in the hallway, arms still crossed, studying her father's face for some sign of what had just happened. "Well?" she asked. "Well," Marcus said, closing the door behind him. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was something smaller and more honest than either. A door left open just enough to see if a man was willing to walk through it slowly, over time, instead of expecting to be let in all at once because he'd finally said the right words out loud. Spring came back to Persimmon Court the way it always did in Georgia. Early and insistent. Dogwoods blooming along the cul-de-sac before most of the neighborhood had finished their taxes. The air thick with pollen and the particular green smell of everything waking up at once. But this spring was different at 214 Persimmon Court because for the first time in 6 months, the raised beds along the back fence weren't empty. It started on a Saturday morning in March with Marcus, Jada, and 6 bags of fresh topsoil delivered the day before, still cool from sitting overnight in the shade. Denise showed up around 9 with a flat of tomato seedlings she'd started from seed back in January. Insurance, she called it. In case you wanted a head start instead of waiting on Direxo. And by 10, Tom Alvarez had wandered over from 3 doors down with a folding table and an offer to help, still visibly carrying the weight of his earlier silence, still trying, in his own quiet way, to make something right. You don't have to help, Marcus told him, not unkindly, handing him a trowel anyway. I know, Tom said. I want to. What began as the 3 of them working the beds turned into something larger over the following weeks, almost without anyone planning it that way. A neighbor 2 streets over who'd heard the story through the group chat dropped off a flat of pepper starts with a note that just said saw what happened. Wanted to help however I could. The Ramirez family from Willow Court, who Marcus had never even met, showed up one Saturday with their 2 kids and a bag of sunflower seeds specifically, because their youngest had heard the story and insisted on it. She said the sunflowers should come back first, Mrs. Ramirez explained, a little embarrassed, watching her 7-year-old daughter carefully press seeds into the soil along the fence line, exactly where the old ones had stood. Something about how they turned toward the sun, no matter what happened to them. I don't know where she got that, but I couldn't really argue with it. Marcus watched the little girl work, small hands patting dirt over each seed with the careful seriousness of someone who understood, in whatever way a 7-year-old understands anything, that this mattered. Neither can I, he said quietly. By April, what had once been 4 raised beds belonging exclusively to the Whitfield family had become something closer to 6, with Denise's yard and the strip of unused grass beside it folded into the project, an informal community garden that nobody had voted on or organized through any HOA committee. It had simply grown that way, the same patient, unhurried way most good things grow, one interested neighbor and one dropped-off seedling at a time. Jada took to it in a way that surprised even her father. She'd always helped in the garden because it was her mother's garden, because tending it felt like tending a memory she was afraid of losing. But this spring, something had shifted. She started keeping a small notebook, planting dates, which beds got morning sun, and which got shade past 2, notes on which tomato varieties the Ramirez kids liked best for snacking straight off the vine. She organized a rotating watering schedule among the 4 households now involved, taped a laminated copy to the inside of the Whitfield garden shed, and took to calling herself, half joking and half serious, the garden manager, whenever anyone asked who was in charge. You know, Denise said one evening, watching Jada explain the watering rotation to the Ramirez girl with the patient authority of someone twice her age. She's turned this into something bigger than what it was before. I don't know if that would have happened without everything that happened. I've thought about that, Marcus admitted, sitting on the porch steps with a glass of sweet tea, watching the last of the evening light catch the new sunflower shoots pushing up along the fence, barely 6 inches tall yet, nowhere near their full height, but unmistakably alive. I don't want to make it sound like something good came out of what he did. Nothing good came out of that. But she took something that was meant to isolate us and turned it into something that pulled half the street in instead. That's her doing, not his. She's your daughter, Denise said. Where else would that instinct come from? Marcus didn't answer that directly, just watched Jada crouch beside the Ramirez girl, showing her how to check a tomato seedling stem for the telltale purple tint that meant it needed more phosphorus, the same lesson Renata had taught him 15 years ago, passed down now to a child who'd never even met the woman whose garden this had once, technically, only belonged to. Gary Pruitt watched all of it from his own back fence sometimes, though never for long, and never with the easy ownership he used to bring to standing there. He didn't offer commentary anymore. Some evenings he'd nod if Marcus caught his eye, and Marcus would nod back, not warmth, not yet, but the specific, careful civility of 2 men who'd agreed, without ever saying so directly, to let time do the work neither of them could rush. In May, Gary did something that surprised the whole street. He showed up one Saturday morning with a truckload of mulch he'd bought himself unprompted, and left it stacked at the edge of his own driveway with a handwritten note taped to the top. Figured the beds could use it, no strings attached, leave it here as long as you need. He didn't come over to help spread it. He didn't ask for credit. He just left it there and went back inside. And Marcus noticed it before anyone said a word about where it had come from. "You gonna use his mulch?" Jada asked, arms crossed, studying the stack with an expression that hadn't fully softened yet, and Marcus understood that some wounds took longer to heal in a 15-year-old than in the adults around her, and he wasn't going to rush that either. "I think we will," Marcus said carefully. "Not because it fixes anything, but because refusing it wouldn't undo what happened either. And I'd rather let a small, genuine gesture be what it is instead of finding a reason to reject it just to prove a point." Jada considered that for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the way she'd started nodding at more and more of her father's careful distinctions over the past year, not blind agreement, but the beginning of understanding why he drew the lines where he drew them. By June, the garden had outgrown even its expanded borders. The sunflowers stood nearly 4 feet tall, still climbing, still turning east every morning out of some inherited habit that had nothing to do with anyone's intentions and everything to do with what sunflowers had always done. The tomato vines were thick with green fruit not yet ripe. The collards had come back full and broad-leafed, exactly as they'd always been, as if the garden itself had decided that whatever had tried to kill it wasn't going to get the final word. Marcus stood at the fence one evening in late June, alone, Jada inside finishing homework, the whole neighborhood quiet in the particular gold hush of a Georgia summer evening. He didn't feel triumphant, exactly. He felt something quieter than that, a kind of settled peace that came less from anything Gary Pruitt had or hadn't done, and more from watching something his wife started 3 years ago prove, in its own patient way, that it couldn't be permanently destroyed by one man's cruelty. It had only needed people willing to replant it. By the following spring, nearly a year after the soil samples first came back positive, the story of the garden on Persimmon Court had traveled further than anyone in Sycamore Ridge had expected it to. It started small, a segment on a local Atlanta News affiliate, not about Gary Pruitt specifically, but about a new initiative the Fulton County District Attorney's Office had quietly rolled out that winter. A public awareness and rapid response program aimed at property crimes motivated by discriminatory intent, cases that historically fell into a gray area between simple vandalism and something that deserved to be taken more seriously. The program hadn't been Marcus's idea alone. A working group of prosecutors, community advocates, and civil rights attorneys had been developing frameworks like it in counties across the state. But the Whitfield case had become, unofficially, one of the models cited in the internal proposal that got the funding approved. Marcus hadn't sought the attention. When a reporter reached out asking if he'd be willing to speak on camera about what had happened to his family's garden, he'd initially declined, uncomfortable with the idea of turning something so personal into a public talking point. It was his supervisor, ultimately, who convinced him otherwise. "You don't have to make it about you," she told him. "But there are 100 families out there right now dealing with something similar who don't have a law degree, don't know how to document a pattern, don't know their HOA is required to keep records of dismissed complaints. You know how to talk about that in a way that actually helps them. That's worth 10 minutes of discomfort." So he agreed to one interview, brief and measured, careful never to name Gary Pruitt directly, focused instead on what the process had taught him, how important documentation was, how patterns mattered more than single incidents, how the system, slow and imperfect as it could be, still worked when people gave it the evidence it needed to work with. The segment aired in February. Within a week, Marcus's office had fielded over 30 calls from residents across 3 counties describing situations that echoed some version of his own. Harassment campaigns disguised as HOA complaints, property damage that never quite rose to the level local police departments knew how to categorize, patterns nobody had thought to document until it was almost too late. The new initiative got its first real test caseload almost overnight. Back on Persimmon Court, the ripple moved quieter, but no less real. Denise stopped by on a Sunday afternoon in April, finding Marcus in the garden checking the tomato cages, and mentioned, almost as an aside, a conversation she'd had that week with a woman 2 streets over, someone Marcus barely knew, whose name he could place only vaguely to a house on Willow Court. "She stopped me at the mailbox," Denise said. Wanted to tell me, didn't even really know how to ask you directly. I think that things feel different around here now. Said she's lived in this neighborhood 11 years and always felt like there was this current running underneath everything. Comments people made, jokes people laughed at that she never felt like she could say anything about. She said after everything with Gary, people got quieter about that stuff. Not because anybody told them to, just because they'd watched what happened when it stopped being quiet. Marcus straightened up from the tomato cage, turning that over. She said all that unprompted? Completely unprompted, Denise said. I didn't even bring up your name. She just said the street feels different. Said her kids play outside more now, feel more comfortable. And she couldn't fully explain why except that something shifted after last year. Marcus didn't say much in response, he rarely did, when something landed with real weight, but he thought about it for the rest of the afternoon, working the beds in the low gold light. Turning the words over the way, he turned over most things that mattered. The HOA, too, had changed in small but tangible ways. The board, stung by the public record of 5 baseless complaints that had gone unchallenged for months before anyone thought to look at them as a pattern, had implemented a new review process that spring. Any resident filing more than 2 complaints against the same household within a 6-month period would trigger an automatic review by a 3-person panel, rather than being processed one at a time in isolation. It wasn't a perfect fix. Marcus knew better than most that no policy closed every gap a determined bad actor could find. But it was a structural acknowledgement that the old system had failed his family for 2 years before it ever caught up to what was actually happening. And that mattered, even if it came a year too late to undo what had already been lost. Gary Pruitt, for his part, had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like a quieter version of the life he used to lead. His probation ended in the fall. He still mowed his lawn on Saturdays, still kept his flag out front, but the loud, performative certainty that used to define him at the mailbox had thinned into something more careful, more watchful of his own words. Whether out of genuine change or simple self-preservation, Marcus honestly couldn't say, and had stopped trying to guess. Kevin, his son, started visiting again that spring, and one Sunday afternoon Marcus caught the 2 of them in the driveway. Kevin's kids running around the front yard while Gary stood there in his golf shirt looking, for the first time in longer than Marcus could remember, genuinely at ease rather than performing ease for an audience. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, that Marcus felt watching that small, ordinary scene. It was something closer to relief that a family could still find its way back to something resembling normal, even after everything. Jada, for her part, had started something of her own that spring. A small gardening mentorship she ran on Saturday mornings for the younger kids on the block, the Ramirez girl included, teaching them the same basics her mother had once taught her. Soil, sun, patience, the particular satisfaction of watching something you planted with your own hands survive long enough to bear fruit. She never called it anything formal. She didn't need to. It had simply become part of the rhythm of Persimmon Court, the same quiet, unforced way the garden itself had grown back. Marcus watched her one Saturday from a porch, surrounded by 4 kids half her age, patiently explaining why the tomato cages needed to go in before the plants got too tall to move them safely, and thought, not for the first time, that some of the best things that came out of that terrible year hadn't been decided by any court, any settlement, any policy change at the county level. They'd been decided quietly and without anyone's permission, by a 15-year-old girl who'd refused to let one man's cruelty be the last word on what her mother's garden was allowed to become. 2 years to the week after the soil samples first confirmed what the family already suspected, Marcus stood at the back fence on a warm September evening, watching the last light settle gold over Persimmon Court, and found himself doing something he rarely allowed himself in the middle of an ordinary day, simply looking, without cataloging, without building a case out of what he saw. The garden had grown well past anything it had been before. 8 raised beds now stretched along what used to be a single property line, folded seamlessly into a shared space that 4 different households tended on a rotating schedule. Jada still managed from her laminated chart in the shed, though she'd handed off most of the actual scheduling duties to the Ramirez girl, who at 9 years old had inherited the title of garden manager, with the same serious pride Jada once carried it with. The sunflowers stood taller than Marcus now, a full wall of them turning east every morning, exactly the way they always had, exactly the way they always would, regardless of what any single person tried to do to stop them. Jada was 18 now, 3 weeks from leaving for college, a state school 2 hours north, close enough to come home on weekends, far enough that Marcus had already started noticing the particular ache of a house getting quieter by degrees. She'd chosen to study environmental policy, a decision she'd made, she told him once, somewhere in the middle of that terrible year when she'd watched a system fail her family for months before it finally caught up to the truth. "I want to work on the stuff that catches things earlier," she told him, "before it gets as far as it got with us." Marcus hadn't pushed her toward it. He hadn't needed to. She'd found her own way there, the same patient, unhurried way most things worth having tend to arrive, not handed down, but grown. Denise came out onto her own porch that evening with 2 glasses of sweet tea, handing one over the low fence that no longer separated much of anything meaningful between their 2 yards. "You look like a man thinking too hard about something simple," she said. Settling into the folding chair she kept permanently stationed at that spot now, a fixture of the garden the way the raised beds themselves had become. "Just watching," Marcus said, "trying to remember what this looked like the morning we found it dead." "Don't do that to yourself on a nice evening." "I'm not doing it to torture myself," he said, taking a sip of the tea. "I'm doing it because I think it's worth remembering, every now and then, how close something can come to being lost completely, and how much it takes to bring it back. Makes you appreciate the ordinary evenings more, I think. The ones where nothing dramatic is happening at all." Denise didn't argue with that. She'd learned over the years of knowing him that Marcus's stillness wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the discipline of a man who'd chosen, deliberately, which feelings got to shape how he moved through the world, and gratitude had won out in the end over the bitterness that would have been easier and, in its own way, more understandable. 2 houses down, Gary Pruitt's porch light flicked on as the evening dimmed further, and Marcus caught sight of him through the fence gap, older now, a little more stooped, sitting alone on his own steps the way he did most evenings since Kevin's visits had tapered back off after a job relocation to Nashville. He raised a hand in a small wave when he noticed Marcus looking, and Marcus raised his own in return, not warmth exactly, not friendship, but the particular, hard-won civility of 2 men who'd found a way to share 12 feet of fence line without either one pretending the history between them had never happened. It wasn't forgiveness in the complete sense. Marcus had never offered that, and he'd meant it years ago when he told Gary as much on that porch that some things get resolved slowly through a long stretch of actually being different, rather than all at once through the right words spoken at the right moment. What existed between them now was something smaller and in its own way more honest. 2 neighbors who'd both been permanently changed by what happened, who'd both, in their different ways, chosen to keep showing up rather than let the wound calcify into something neither of them could ever move past. Jada came out onto the porch as the sky deepened toward violet, phone in hand, scrolling through something with the particular half-smile she got when she found something worth sharing. "Dad, look at this." She held out the screen. It was a message from her friend Amara, forwarded from a cousin in Ohio. A local news story about a family whose fence-line garden dispute with a hostile neighbor had gotten resolved through mediation before it ever escalated, citing, explicitly, the documentation framework the DA's office in Fulton County had helped popularize 2 years earlier. "Saw this and thought of your dad," the message read. Marcus read it twice, then handed the phone back, something settling in his chest that he didn't have an easy word for, not pride exactly, though there was some of that in it, but something closer to the quiet satisfaction of watching a single terrible morning ripple outward into something that had, in some small way he couldn't have predicted, made things a little easier for people he'd never meet. "Feels strange," Jada said, "knowing something that happened to us actually helped somebody else." "It usually works that way, if you let it," Marcus said. "The worst things that happen to us don't have to just stay wounds. Sometimes, if you're patient with them long enough, they turn into something that protects somebody else from going through the same thing blind." Jada considered that, leaning against the porch railing, watching the sunflowers sway faintly in the last of the evening breeze. "You think Mom would like what we did with it? The garden, I mean. All of it." Marcus looked out at the beds, the tomatoes, the collards, the sunflowers standing tall and unbothered against a fence line that had once tried to poison them out of existence, and felt something settle into place, quiet and certain, the way only a few things in a man's life ever truly did. "I think," he said slowly, "she'd say it turned out exactly the way something planted with love is supposed to turn out. Bigger than the ground it started in. Harder to kill than anybody expects." Jada smiled, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, content to simply stand there in the fading light, watching a garden that had once been left for dead keep doing, patiently and without permission, exactly what it had always done, reaching toward whatever light was available, and growing anyway. There's a particular kind of cruelty that hides behind the word neighborly, the kind that smiles at your fence line while quietly deciding, behind closed doors, that you don't belong. Gary Pruitt spent 2 years perfecting that particular performance, filing complaint after complaint dressed up as concern for property values, for neighborhood standards, for all the polite language people reach for when they don't want to say the real thing out loud. And when the system kept dismissing him, kept refusing to validate the resentment he'd built his whole sense of self around, he did what people like him have always done throughout history when they run out of official channels. He reached for destruction instead. What he never accounted for was who he was destroying it in front of. Marcus Whitfield's power was never in his title. It was in the 20 years of discipline that came before the title ever mattered. The discipline to document instead of confront, to let evidence build a case that his own outrage never could have built alone, to absorb 2 years of small cruelties without ever handing his tormentor the reaction he was fishing for. That discipline is what won this story, long before any radio call ever crackled through that yard. The badge, the title, the office down at the Fulton County Courthouse, those were just the mechanism the truth finally used to walk through the door. The real strength had been standing at that fence line the whole time, wearing an undershirt, tending tomato plants before sunrise. And that's really what this story was about underneath everything. Not the reveal, dramatic as it was. Not even the consequences, thorough as they were. It was about a garden that refused to stay dead. It was about a family that took the worst thing a bitter man could do to them and turned it slowly, patiently, into something that pulled half a neighborhood together instead of tearing it apart. It was about a father who understood that justice and vengeance are not the same instinct, even when they're standing in the same yard, even when every reasonable person would have forgiven him for choosing the easier one. And it was about a daughter who watched her father hold that line again and again, and grew into someone who chose, on her own, to plant something bigger than what was taken from her. That's the real reversal in every story like this one. It's never really about watching a bigot get what's coming to him, satisfying as that moment always is. It's about watching the people he tried to diminish refuse to be defined by his smallness, refuse to let his cruelty become the last word on who they were or what they were capable of building, even in the exact soil he tried to poison. Gary Pruitt is still living on Persimmon Court today, older, quieter, carrying the particular weight of a man who has to look at what he almost destroyed every time he steps into his own backyard. That's its own kind of sentence, longer than any fine, harder to shake than any probation term. But the garden is taller than it's ever been. The sunflowers still turn east every morning, exactly the way they always have, exactly the way they always will, because some things, once planted with enough love, simply refuse to stay down no matter who tries to put them there. If this story moved something in you tonight, do me a favor before you go. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing just how far these stories travel, city to city, country to country. And it means more than you know to see that community show up every single time. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because these stories don't stop here. I've got 2 more coming up that I handpicked just for you, and I think you're going to want to see both of them. One follows a young ER nurse who gets humiliated by an arrogant hospital administrator in front of an entire waiting room, right up until a trauma call comes in, and everyone finds out exactly who she really is underneath that scrubs uniform. The other one takes us into a courtroom, where a bailiff makes the mistake of assuming the quiet young woman sitting alone at the defendant's table doesn't know the first thing about the law. A mistake he will not get to make twice. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and for sitting with this story all the way through to the end. Stories like this only reach the people who need them because of you, because you comment, you share, you keep coming back. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for that. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of each other out there.